Welcome to the Africa Briefing Room, where we provide editorial analysis on the latest developments shaping the continent. Today's commentary focuses on Burkina Faso. On August 18, 2025, the government expelled the United Nations resident humanitarian coordinator, Carol Flore-Smereczniak. The decision followed a UN report documenting child rights violations. Authorities in Ouagadougou rejected the report as unsubstantiated, exclusionary of national input, and unfairly attributing blame to the country's security forces. This development is about more than a dispute over figures. It raises broader questions about how international institutions document crises, whose voices shape these reports, and whether accountability applies consistently across different contexts. The reality is that diplomatic consequences often reflect international leverage rather than the severity of violations. Consider Yemen. When the UN first blacklisted Saudi Arabia in 2016 for child rights violations in its Yemen military campaign, the kingdom threatened to cut $100 million in funding to UN programs. Saudi Arabia was removed from the blacklist within days. This set a precedent, even as violations continued, with the UN documenting an estimated 729 children casualties attributed to the Saudi coalition in 2019. Diplomatic consequences remained minimal. Thousands of children casualties were attributed to the Saudi-led coalition over the years, yet Riyadh faced limited lasting accountability. By contrast, states like Burkina Faso, with less international leverage, face significant political fallout when reports are published. They lack the financial influence to pressure the UN system, and their expulsions of UN officials become front-page news while Saudi Arabia's threats remain diplomatic footnotes. The mechanism is clear. Powerful states can leverage funding and political pressure to minimize consequences, while vulnerable states absorb the full diplomatic cost of critical reports. If protecting children is truly the driving concern, should accountability not apply consistently, regardless of whether the violating state can threaten UN budgets or lacks the financial leverage to influence institutional responses? Beyond the question of power and accountability lies another concern: consultation and processes. The consultation process deserves deeper scrutiny. In August 2025, multiple official statements from the Burkinabè authorities stated that they were neither involved in the preparation of the UN report nor informed of its findings before publication. This is not merely a procedural issue. It goes to the heart of the report's legitimacy. The UN's standard practice does involve country visits, government meetings, and stakeholder consultations. However, the quality and depth of these consultations can vary widely, sometimes due to practical barriers, such as security risks, limitations on access, or government restrictions. South Sudanese officials, for example, have, across several years, accused the UN of launching investigations without meaningful dialogue, at times calling findings fabrications, based on what they described as inadequate consultation. In contrast, when governments do cooperate with UN investigations, as seen in Colombia's peace process monitoring, the resulting reports tend to be more nuanced and collaborative. Questions about methodology are central. Who selects the local sources? How are testimonies verified? According to Burkinabè government statements, the report's methodology failed to adequately distinguish between terrorist groups and state forces in its sourcing. They expressed concern that if most testimony comes from local civil society groups or international NGOs with limited access to government-controlled areas, the resulting narrative may inevitably skew toward anti-government perspectives. It is also important to acknowledge that in certain situations, the UN's ability to engage with all stakeholders may be constrained by factors outside its control. Still, when national authorities are not included in framing the scope of investigations, there is a real risk that reports will be perceived as less collaborative and more like external verdicts handed down from outside, which diminishes their acceptance and potential impact. But the stakes extend beyond process to perception. Reports don't just document, they shape how the international community understands conflicts and judges governments. These reports are quoted in the media or by diplomats in speeches, and sometimes used to justify sanctions or aid conditions. But which stories get amplified reveals a clear pattern. For instance, when news breaks about the use of child soldiers anywhere on the continent, UN reports on this issue often make front-page news. Meanwhile, Stories about the role of foreign mining companies in fueling the very same conflicts rarely receive significant international coverage. This pattern highlights that narratives critical of vulnerable states are amplified. Narratives implicating powerful states or corporations are quietly minimized. This raises a fundamental question about sourcing. UN findings often draw heavily from external sources, such as NGOs, local monitors, even advocacy organizations. That is not inherently illegitimate, but it raises doubts about neutrality when those groups are themselves politically invested. The concern isn't whether these organizations do important work. They often do, but their institutional perspectives and funding priorities might shape how evidence is gathered and presented. Such critiques are frequently deployed to discredit both the methodology and the final findings of UN investigations. Yet the voices most affected by these dynamics, local communities themselves, often remain marginalized in international discourse. Inside Burkina Faso, local perspectives reveal a different framing of the crisis. Local civil society groups like CISC, Collective contre l'Impunité and the Stigmation des Communities, document the full complexity of the crisis, including how elements within community defense groups like the Volunteers for Defense of the Homeland, originally created to protect villages against terrorism, have in some cases committed abuses through ethnic profiling and revenge attacks. CISC documented cases where armed civilians claiming to be VDP organized targeted abuses against civilian populations following terrorist incidents, creating what they call another type of terrorism. This nuanced understanding shows why local voices are essential. They see dynamics that external reports often miss or oversimplify. The issue isn't just government versus terrorists. It includes community defenders sometimes becoming perpetrators, ethnic stigmatization, and cycles of revenge that complicate simple accountability frameworks. These local voices don't deny the crisis's severity, but they understand its full complexity. The disconnect isn't just about different conclusions, it's about entirely different approaches to understanding and addressing a multi-layered conflict that external observers struggle to capture. This tension ultimately reflects something larger. Burkina Faso's decision reflects the larger reconfiguration of sovereignty in the Sahel. With Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso consolidating under the AES, challenging UN authority represents a symbolic assertion of autonomy from international systems long dominated by Western institutions. Declaring a UN official persona non grata is a bold move, rare, symbolic, and calls the UN's credibility into question. One could argue that the Sahel is not rejecting humanitarian principles. It is rejecting an international system perceived as selective, politicized, and stacked in favor of major powers. In closing, the humanitarian stakes are undeniable. Children in Burkina Faso have suffered through years of insurgent attacks, school closures, and displacement. That much is beyond dispute. The real question, however, is whether the way these issues are recorded and reported is consistent and historically accurate. Why has international reaction differed so drastically between cases like Yemen and the Sahel? Why don't reports about corporations pillaging resources make international headlines? This raises a fundamental question. Are these genuinely UN assessments, or do they primarily reflect the perspectives of the NGOs and advocacy groups that supply the information? If the concern is genuinely about universal child protection, and accountability must be consistent, context-rich, and accurate. The problem is that reports intended to safeguard the vulnerable too often become instruments of international pressure, deployed not to protect children, but to advance political agendas.